Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Good afternoon, good morning. I know some of you are joining from the West Coast, and hopefully, wherever you're calling in from, you're dialing in from someplace warm. We're so excited to have you guys here today. We've got a great panel of experts here with us, and we are really excited to get some great insights from them around AI in special education. So I'll start it off. I'll just introduce each of our panelists, and then we'll get into the meat of it and into why you guys are all here today. So on our panel today, we have Vera Cabero. She is currently the Emerging Technologies Consultant for the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, and she leads North Carolina's AI Implementation Initiative, and she's done extensive AI training with educators across the state. We also have John Fila. He has a background in accessibility and equity and inclusion, and he founded his company, Inclusive AI Strategies, to help mitigate some of the inherent biases that he saw in the use of AI. He's written extensively on the topic. He gives presentations, workshops, and keynotes across the country on it. And we have Mark Staron. He's the CEO and co-founder of University Startups. University Startups is an AI-powered transition planning management system that generates personalized, student-centered transition plans and gives educators the tools to ensure that the IEP transition plans are state and federally compliant. So school data privacy, responsible AI use, those are all topics that Mark lives and breathes every day. All three of our panelists are also former educators, so I'm excited to learn from them today. And knowing our audience that has signed up, we know everyone who has joined us today, you have a wide range of AI experience. Some of you are early adopters, some of you are just starting to dabble in it, and we'll be throwing out terms today like training the model, training the LLM, adjusting your prompt. But before we dive into specific questions, we thought it would be helpful to set the stage and give a quick overview of just how AI works and how the models actually work. So I'll let Vera lead us in giving you guys a quick overview around AI and how it works.
Okay, thank you. Well, again, we know that we have a mixed audience, so I don't want to speak down to anyone, but just to give a very quick, like non-technical overview, AI is a field that has been around since the 1950s, and so it really is not something new. What is new in the last few years that has caused so much buzz in the whole world, but education in particular, is generative AI. And so before that, we had other models like machine learning and things like that. But generative AI is a new version of AI that can actually generate new content, which is where the name comes from. And so at first, it could just generate text. And then now we've seen that in the 3 years since ChatGPT rolled out, we are generating images, audio, even 3D worlds are being generated now, video. And so anything that generates something new is a generative AI model. And so most of the things that you're familiar with, like ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, those are generative models, but they're also large language models or LLMs. So you may hear that term, but that's basically a term that's trained on language. And so they are trained on, like I said, language, but they're trained on a huge data set of pretty much the whole internet, basically all kind of written communication that was in existence. And so they have a huge database. They train on that data. And in that process, they are learning patterns of human language, which is why they're so good at speaking language and sounding human. But then after the model is trained and released, when a user inputs a prompt, the model is actually doing a probabilistic statistical determination of what the answer is. And a lot of people think it's going and retrieving facts, but it's really not. It's probabilistic. Does a pretty good job nowadays of getting things right, but not always. And that's the reason why. And then it gives you your output. So whatever that output is, whether it's text, image, video, audio, it produces that output. And so the big thing to just remember is that they are probabilistic, and so sometimes they do get things wrong. It's been called hallucinations, not something that people in education would have chosen for it to be called. We prefer to call them inaccuracies, but that is the term that's kind of stuck. And then they also, because they're trained on the huge data set of information, they inherit some of the bias that's in that information and the bias of the users or the owners, the people who made the models. And so that's why we have to really be careful with AI, because of how it is trained and how it works. And I know that's very quick and very simplistic, but hopefully that helps kind of set the baseline.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that, Vera. I think that is helpful as we dive into some of these specific questions, especially around some of those topics that you mentioned, biases and some things that users of the models have to be aware of. Before I jump into these questions, I do want to encourage everyone in the audience today to go ahead and type in any of questions that you have that come up as we're going through this. I'll be monitoring the Q&A as well. So there is the Q&A window. Just go ahead, type in your questions, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. I want to make sure that I get all of you guys out of here within the 45-minute time frame that we've set for this, though. Okay, so diving into our first question that we have, and this one is around privacy. According to a report that came out at the end of last year from the Center for Democracy and Technology, 60% of special educators are already using AI to develop an IEP or 504 plan. The report did not break out which tools they're using, but we can probably assume that some of them are using free versions of tools like the common ones, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini. What would you guys say are privacy risks that these educators should be aware of, especially if they're using these tools for developing IEPs and using their student data to do that?
Well, I can jump in there. Let me just circle back to kind of some of what's problematic about the tools themselves. I call them bias engines, because if they are trained on us by us, and we are biased, imperfect creatures, and if they're supposed to sound like us, they will reflect that by default. And so they kind of give stereotypical biased responses, especially based on what algorithms can glean from the prompter themselves. So, if we're using these tools, and we're not aware of that default response, we need to find ways to kind of mitigate that through our prompting techniques. And so I think the free tools especially don't necessarily have FERPA compliance built into it. And so each of them have different privacy settings to allow these tools to train on your data. And if you're putting in content about your learners, then you're essentially handing that over to those companies, so that they can train those tools, and then we're violating the law. If you have, specific contracts and accounts set up that, can ensure that kind of privacy, that would definitely, give you another layer of security. I think because so many teachers are using it, I think thinking about how you're using it is helpful. So, we're thinking about using these tools as thought partners. And if we're using these tools, we should be de-identifying any kind of assessment data, and making sure that people are drafting their goals based on their knowledge of students and using LLMs to kind of check if the language is measurable and specific. So the idea is that we're using it to enhance ourselves and use it as a collaborator and an assistant, not to get answers from the tools, because some of those answers can end up being problematic.
And I'll just kind of chime in with that. As he kind of referenced already, that using the free tools is where we really have a lot of concerns, because you absolutely do not have any data protection. The old adage that if it's free, you are the product, or in this case, your student data may be the product. And so we have to be super careful about that. There are tools, and ChatGPT has a for teachers version now. Gemini has an EDU version that do provide a little added security. They promise not to train on your data and things like that, but we still are pretty concerned about that, because PowerSchool was supposed to be secure too, and we all know kind of what happened with that. So I really feel like we need to practice data minimization. I think that sometimes we provide a lot more data than what is necessary. And even if you are using a sanctioned tool in your school or district, I really recommend that you not include PII data. And anybody who was not trained in PII, freshly or recently really needs to be retrained in what PII is. Those kinds of information like the name, social security number, address, birth dates, and of course testing data and all of the a lot of EC data actually falls under HIPAA also, medical data. So those are all things that you absolutely should not be inputting into any model, even one of the sanctioned ones by your district, unless you're specifically directed to. And I think that if we're all just careful, and I've also had some confusion with this, with which I think is worth pointing out, with like spreadsheets of data and documents and things like that. I've had some people who were under the belief that if they just hit a column or a row in a spreadsheet, or if they put a nice black box over a piece of data, that it was hidden. And hidden from a human is not the same as hidden from a machine. And so those methods would be still machine readable. So no matter how many columns or tabs or rows you hide or how many black boxes you have, when you put that into an AI system, it can read that underlying data. And so we need to make sure that we're really anonymizing and sanitizing before we put anything into a system.
I would just add to that quickly. It isn't just the PII that we need to worry about because I've seen research that indicates that students of color in their IEPs are often identified by race within the first two lines, and that's not something that typically happens with white students. And so these tools will generate responses based on any of the information that we're providing it. And so if we're identifying students by race or gender, then we'll get responses that reflect those stereotypes as well. So even if it's not personal, we also need to kind of review what data are we sharing, what do we need to be careful about in terms of the types of responses that we're going to receive.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Eliza, just two more points. This is very well said. Is one is that teacher information also violates the law. So you want to make sure that you're not including teacher information when you do these searches. And second, if you're partnering with vendors, make sure that they're vetted as well. Make sure that there's an encryption process that they go through. Make sure that they're audited, whether it's SOC compliance, GovRAMP. There's a whole bunch of compliance that the companies themselves must go through themselves in order to work with school districts. So just be careful who you work with. I think it's an important element as you move forward with working with these great students.
Yeah, and I would even add to that because there are so many AI platforms that have sprung up. I mean, literally thousands. And every time one of these main models has an update, some of those startups will go out of business. And so that's one thing that we learned from the situation in LA a couple of years ago is that when a business goes out of business, you need to know what happens to the data at that point also when you're vetting vendors. That's an important consideration that a lot of people don't think of, but because of the way these models are improving, that does happen quite often where somebody will sign up with a new tool and then ChatGPT or Gemini will roll out something that puts them out of business. And then that data sometimes is transferred to a new company that doesn't have the same compliance. And so that's something that's really important to consider from a district leader standpoint.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. So now educators who are listening to this, hopefully they're more aware of some things that they should not be doing, some of the information they should not be entering into these AI tools. What would you say are some of the information that is okay to enter? Because again, they are going to be using these tools to write IEPs, to write these goals. What is okay for them to enter into the tools?
Well, some of the things that I've done with when I've done lesson creation, I'm only recently out of the classroom. I was teaching up until last June for the previous 26 years in settings that were largely special ed. And so I could take an existing lesson and say, take an accommodation like access to notes or prior content. Even if I didn't have those notes, and the student was entitled to those, I could generate notes based off of the content that then I could review, edit, kind of distill down into what I thought was important and provide that to students. I could say, review this lesson, create a one-page study guide that chunks key information into distinct sections with clear headings, include a summary at the end, and format it for accessibility. And so we can I mean, those are all extremely useful ways of kind of engaging with these tools. And then when I get that content, now I make that part of the class. And so that's an improvement for everybody in the class. And I'm meeting some of those common accommodations and modifications that come up in IEPs and 504s.
Yeah, I think those are great. Additionally, something that we have in our guidelines, we've added an addendum for EC teachers specifically, and it does provide some ways that they could be used to create accommodations, as he said. But so it's okay to say, like I have a student, and as he said, even identifying a gender sometimes does introduce bias. So I really don't even recommend using pronouns. I have a student that has, these difficulties, this situation. And so you could say, like, a student who is reading at a second grade level, but has, high intelligence scores, scores highly in other ways, whatever their specific strengths are. And you can personalize down to an individual student level as well, but just being very careful about how you word it. You can use it. And we have some in our guidelines, we reference a human AI human model, where the really important thing is that the human is really forming that prompt carefully, using the concerns for bias and PII, and also personalizing. And then you can let the AI do a lot of things to help you, like building instructional support layers, simplifying complex standards down into something, identifying misconceptions, things like that. But then on the other end, that needs to be closed out with human oversight again, where the human is really evaluating the content and making sure that it is reflective of what you're looking for, but also targeted to that student or that student group or whatever the case is, and really making sure that it's evaluated well before it's actually shared as well. And we haven't had any instances of North Carolina of teachers sharing that I know of content that was incorrect, but I have heard of that other places where something was generated, not really evaluated well, and then shared out. And that, of course, could be a concern as well.
I found two really awesome uses of AI that support teachers. One is content, which they just mentioned. The second is deep research.
Hmm.
So when you go into these models, you can indicate deep research. But I think what Vera said was so important. We call it humans in the loop. You really still need to verify what it says. A, it doesn't have biases, but B, it's accurate. But it's like a PhD assistant that scans the internet and just really can identify so many things. So it's really a great support and tool for teachers used properly.
Hmm.
I think
Yep.
one other use I can think of is it can just depend on the day, right? So I had a student that had come to me who was very behind in some of his work and freaking out about how he was going to get it all done. Um, so he was very anxious, right? So I could go into one of these tools and I told the large language model, this is the list of things this student needs to work on. He's very anxious. And what are some ideas on how we can get started? Because I was you know, kind of in the middle of that too. I didn't want to feed into that anxiety. So while we were texting back and forth, I was, getting some insights onto where some good starting places might be just to make a little bit of progress. And so then I would kind of distill that down into what I thought that student could hear at that time, and then make those suggestions. And we ended up coming with a pretty good work plan. And it de-escalated the situation when that student was kind of in a bit of crisis. So it isn't just for kind of plugging in accommodations, but case by case circumstances can be very useful you know, if we're overworked as well. And I can paste in my own content and say, are there any examples of bias? Are there any examples where I can make this more accessible? Are there any examples where, I might make these instructions clearer? One of the things that I've done a lot lately is use the Universal Design for Learning and the social emotional learning frameworks and have content aligned to that. And then I can go and review those responses and kind of pick and choose the things I like and the things maybe that aren't relevant to that particular assignment. But, there are lots of ways of kind of improving what we already have instead of trying to create something new from scratch.
Yeah. And I will add to that, he reminded me of something else with the Universal Design for Learning. But I did a webinar recently on being an architect of your own learning content with Notebook LM. And I don't know if you're familiar with Notebook LM, but it is one of the Google products that is just phenomenal. It's come a long way. But in it, a teacher can actually, like I said, architect their own content. They can put in their standards, and you can put in, context about a student or a student group as well, but you can use it to simplify like processes, like create infographics to describe like something like the PMDS, the order of operations, and create like your anchor charts, things like that from it. And it does a really good job if you know how to prompt it well, which is always the key, knowing how to prompt it well. You can create slide decks. Of course, audio podcasts, that's kind of where they got well known, but you can create podcasts because some students are auditory learners, and so to help them understand a topic or a video overview. And so really it's in 2026, we're at the point where teachers don't have to just go take generic content that really is not built for anybody, any particular person or class, and you can really specify what you're looking for and customize it very very well. You can customize it unbelievably well with just some really good detailed context and prompting.
Yeah, I think all of these are great examples of effective ways to use the AI tools without violating some of the privacy and being aware of some of the biases that are inherent in the tools. Notebook LM is like one of my new favorite tools. I've been telling everyone here at University Startups about it. Mark probably is tired of listening to me talk about it. All right, let's see. We have one question come in. Maybe one of you can help answer this one. I do not always change the student name from James to student when creating IEPs and goals. Will this meet confidentiality with educator ChatGPT?
Do you mean in the tool itself? You use a first name? Is that what I'm understanding?
It sounds like that's what they're saying.
My personal recommendation is I would not use even a first name. I've heard some people say first names are okay, and if your name is James, that's probably not going to bring any bias. But depending on what a student name, some of the names also would bring in cultural bias, and that still there is some male female bias still. But I wouldn't use a first name at all, because if you get in that habit, everybody's not going to be Billy, Bob, or Mary. Some of the names are a lot more unique, and I personally I wouldn't even use a first name if it were me. It's probably not breaking any law if it's in the For Teachers version, but that's just my personal recommendation.
Yeah, I would say go in and try it and see what happens. Tell it the student's name is James, but then go in and use the name Samantha. And the other thing is it will try to generate a profile of that learner based on a name. So if their name isn't, you know, a common white name, for instance, if it's something that's used more in a different community, you're going to get those biases and stereotypes reflected back on you. So if you go in and try it with a different names, and you can see the responses generated right in front of you and see what kind of differences they are, those kinds of things are well documented. So, I would avoid those references as much as possible. Or you could do one with a male sounding name and one with a female sounding name, and then kind of combine those responses, because it isn't that the answers are necessarily inherently bad. There are good things about both. But maybe that's something that you could combine and create some synergy around, or even give both responses to a large language model and say, can you combine these responses into a strategy?
Mhm. And that's one thing that I've done often to try to teach others about this is doing exactly what he said. Change from a, stereotypically male name to a stereotypically female name. Use a stereotypically Hispanic or African, and just do the exact same prompt, but only change the name. And you will see that there are differences. And like you said, it doesn't necessarily mean it's all bad, but it is bringing in some of that inherent bias that we're trying to avoid. And so I think it's better not to, for that reason, and for potential, as I said, if it's a unique name that could also bring in some security privacy risk. But
And it will do it to you too. So if the tool knows you as your name, sometimes it welcomes you by your first name. It's giving you biased responses based on what the algorithm has determined you are. And so you can, within your discussions with these tools, ask it not to reference any of your profile data or not to reference previous chats or discussions or projects, depending on the tool that you're using, so that you get kind of a cleaner response. Because it will start to adjust itself based on you and your interactions as well. And one of the things that I do in my workshops is encourage people to lie to these tools. We need to manipulate them, in every way we possibly can. And so I'll often lie to it about my experience, my education, my PhDs, my awards that I've won. Build yourself up so that when it's going to give you a sycophantic response, that it's giving you one that it thinks that needs to be at the caliber of someone that has all of those accolades and all of those degrees, because then you'll get more context to the responses. They'll be more thorough. They're more likely to be accurate. And so, lying to these tools I've found to be a pretty effective strategy for, getting better responses.
and similar, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Vera.
Just gonna say a similar strategy. We still do. Some people will say prompt engineering is dead. I don't necessarily agree with that, because if you just give generic prompts, you're going to get generic outputs. But I created a prompt engineering formula called CRAFT that we have in our guidelines, and that's what the R stands for, is role. And so it's kind of like what he's saying. You can assign it a role to, and saying you are an expert, exceptional education teacher, well versed in the universal design for learning principles, and you can kind of build up the model by giving it a role also, and that really affects the outcome of the answer.
Just going back to the question itself, right? We're trying to personalize it as much as we can to add real value to that particular student. But as a general practice, I would not include anything that might include or subject that student to having their PII available to people we don't want. So I would not include the name. This is just a general practice for what we do. I just wouldn't as a practice. If you want to include their sex and their nationality and ethnicity and things like that, you certainly can, to understand what a personalized pathway for that individual can look like. But when it comes to PII, I would just be very wary, not just in these general models, but again, with your partners as well.
And one thing I want to add to that, because it's another discussion that's come up often, is a lot of people don't realize that a student number is PII, but it is. And so that's one thing that we've been really trying to train our educators, is do not use student numbers, because a lot of people were using those instead of names and thinking they're anonymous, but that is a one-to-one match to an individual student. And so it is definitely PII, so I would not be using those as either.
And your partners that you work with, I would ask them, have they gone through an audit? What are their encryption policies? What are their data removal policies after the contract is end, or during acquisition? There's a whole bunch of things we can do to make sure that our students are safe. That is just some simple, basic check mark questions. And we can provide that list of questions that you want to ask to make sure that we're keeping these kids safe.
Yeah, I think those are all really great, helpful points. Mark, you brought up something about personalized output. So I think that's a good segue into another question that we have here. We know that IDEA requires each IEP to be unique and tailored to each student. And in fact, we hear that all the time with educators who have come to us and want to work with us. They were found out of compliance for generic transition plans, and now they're coming to us for a solution. So with that in mind, what do you guys say to educators? What do educators need to know about the potential IDEA compliance risk when they're using some of these AI tools?
I would say the tools are meant to be generic. They very rarely give you the kind of specific information that you need. So you need to use your knowledge about that individual and make sure that these things truly are personalized to that student. the other thing that will often come up because these responses are so generic is, there's all this stuff, this persistent educational myth around learning styles, that's been debunked by research for decades, is still something that I see come up and talk about. I had to take a grad school class in it, well after the research had come out. Those are often the types of responses you'll get when you get suggestions from these tools. It will make suggestions around students' learning styles. And so we have to, knowing that as professionals, that these educational myths persist, we have to tell it also what we don't want. And so if we kind of create our own frameworks and guidelines when we're working with these tools, again, we are the professionals. We are ultimately responsible for the content that we create and that gets used and put in front of learners or the public. And so, creating a kind of a default cheat sheet for yourself when you're prompting, so that you know not just what you want, but what you for sure don't want, will help you get better responses there too.
Yeah, I agree. I pretty much consider everything a draft. AI helps you get to the draft, but you've got to make sure that you're doing that human oversight to make sure that it is personalized, and that's your job. That AI will never know your students or your community. And you can also train, I mean, they are trained on all of the, whatever learning framework you're using, 5E, whatever, you can add that to the context also. And any of, and one thing I really recommend people to always add is that universal design for learning. And so you can kind of train up your AI to make sure it's following whatever procedures or protocols that you're using. Universal design for learning is a great one, but that's really important too. But then ultimately, we have a framework also in our guidelines called Every, and how to use responsibly every AI responsibly every time, and it's evaluate, verify, edit, revise. But the last one is that you are responsible for the AI's output as the human, and you're responsible for disclosing it appropriately and all of that. But that's the most important component, is just make sure you're not relegating your thinking to the AI. It can do a lot to help you, but you've got to make sure you're responsible for evaluating and thinking it.
I love that acronym, by the way. You're gonna have to share that with everybody. That's awesome. Think of the LLM is massive. It's training on all this data across so many different sources, and we're focusing on very particular segment of our community. So you have to make sure that it's trained specifically on indicator 13, that it has those outcomes to really make sure that these are measurable goals and that it's not influenced by other gen ed statutes, other gen ed training models. It's very, very complicated, all these information that they're getting. So I love Vera's acronym at the end of the U, to make sure that you're really the human in the loop, to ensure that it's not biased, the gen ed colleagues that go through this model, and that whatever you're using is trained specifically on indicator 13, so you have these measurable goals and that we're compliant.
I think
Yeah, that,
another layer of
yep.
security is that, you know, because the number one indicator of human preference is seeing information that already aligns with our beliefs, and these tools are inherently sycophantic, and that problem not just persists, it's actually getting worse, because these products need people to keep coming back. So it's, of course, it's always going to tell you you're brilliant, that that's a great idea, and absolutely, it's really going to feed into that, and your ego. And so not just being the human that reviews the responses, but I would suggest having a collaborator, another human collaborator, as part of your workflow. And when you come up with something, also have someone else review it from their perspective, so that maybe you missed something because it was already aligning with something you wanted to hear. And having that extra layer, and accountability and some back and forth with another human, you know all innovation comes from collaboration. And so the more we can get people talking and together and out of their individual workflow, I think we're going to be better off.
Mhm. Yep, and I agree with that entirely. And I've started including that in my trainings also because a lot of people are not aware of that sycophancy. And you can put sometimes some ridiculous things in there, like business ideas and stuff, and it will say, "Oh yeah, that's a fantastic idea." But you also, I really, we train as part of our prompting process how to prompt for objectivity, because we are blind to our own blind spots. That's why they're called blind spots. And so we also have to be careful that because of the context in your prompt, if you are prompting it in a biased manner, especially around, I was a social studies teacher, hot button, current events and things like that, then you are going to get a biased response. And we certainly don't want to be passing on our biases to our students. And so it's really important to prompt for objectivity. And we've got like a list of prompt stems that we share that help people to understand that they can just kind of plug into their own prompts, because we are blind to our own blind spots.
I think that's so important. I mean, if you go in with a preconceived idea and say, I really like this example, what do you think? Well, of course, ChatGPT loves it too. You're already telling it you like. If you say you don't like it, it's going to tell you all the reasons why you shouldn't like it. And so that's baked into the system to the point where that's actually what's causing more problems with some of the AI psychosis that's coming in and people kind of developing these delusions of grandeur. I know that's a relatively small percentage of the population, but it's a real effect that's happening and that's leading to serious consequences for some people.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Sometimes when I'm using Claude, it makes me feel so good. I'll be like, what about this idea? And they're like, oh, that is such a great idea.
You need that boost in
And
the
I pat
day.
myself on the back.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, I want to go back to something that Mark brought up as far as what the AI tools have been trained on. So some of these open source models like ChatGPT are trained on a lot of information. Some of these purpose-built tools are trained very specifically for specific purposes, specific populations. So we know not all tools are created equal. Vera, when we were chatting before this webinar, you mentioned that you had some specific examples from North Carolina, especially around like some of the differences between these free tools and the paid tools. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that plays into decisions that educators have to make about which tools to use?
Well, we have a third party data agreement in North Carolina that they have to go through, which a lot of that we've kind of talked through already. But it is just important because a lot of districts are still kind of blocking banning even for teachers, and so a lot of people are kind of on the sly using the free tools and because they're not allowed to use them. And so we just want to make sure that people do understand that level of that you really have no guarantee of privacy or security on any of the free tools. I mean, you can, whichever platform it is, if you're on a personal account, not on your school account, it doesn't matter what platform you're using. If you're using the free tool, that it is not, there's no privacy guaranteed whatsoever. And then if you're using a Google for Education account, you're using Gemini on that account, then it does fall under that privacy guarantee of Google that they're not training on it. And same thing with like ChatGPT personal versus ChatGPT for teachers. Same thing with Claude. They have an education version. And if you pay for it, you get better protection than on the free one. And there's also other differences between the free and the paid, such as, of course, your limits. What you can do is limited as well. But I think that's just really important for people to understand that, because a lot of people are using it, kind of unsanctioned by their district, and putting in, whether districts realize they're using them or not. They're using them to, the majority of teachers, I think in the most recent surveys, between which when you're looking at 60 to 70% are using the tools. And that's kind of lines up with the exceptional children teachers as well.
Just back to your point, Eliza, about the large language models versus ones that maybe have a narrow scope of training. I've seen research that indicates that large language models outperform more narrowly scoped and informed language models. Uh, there is something in having that kind of wide berth of knowledge and being able to respond to questions um, more accurately, more usefully, more contextually, that it's important that when we're using those tools, though, that we still can create guardrails around very specific things. We can give it specific training documents that focus on the data we want it to, because they largely have training on that as well. And if we kind of create our own support documents, almost everything I do starts with an upload of support documents that I want to be followed within the context of our discussion. So I'm taking the power of that large language model, but I'm more narrowly defining the scope of what I think is appropriate information for it to focus on. Does that make sense?
It does, definitely. And kind of along those lines, some of the tools that you're talking about, some of the more narrowly focused tools, of that, they are not performing as well. So even though a lot of people might be recommending them in their districts, people realize that they're getting better responses from something like ChatGPT. So they're still going there and using that. Some districts are even like running systems locally, build their own AI on their own system, which does increase the privacy exponentially, but then those models are not getting the updates and things, and they do tend to not perform as well. And so there's that trade-off, and a lot of people are still going to use the large language model
Right.
for that reason. But he was talking about adding adding documents for context and everything, and that just kind of going back to our PI discussion. Another thing that I've been really clarifying with my educators, because now these systems are all multimodal, and so it's not just you upload a doc or type something in. People need to realize also that if you are uploading files to them, they have to follow that same protocol with being anonymized. But also that, I've seen people even like turning the camera on and using the camera in a classroom, and you are exposing all those children's faces, or uploading pictures of students and doing something cute like, them, what their career will be in 20 years. And, so things like that, you got to remember, if you're using the voice features on the apps or the chat GPT or whatever, that's also capturing student voices. Now my voice is out there all over, as is my image and my video, but I would never do that with any of my student data. And so we've got to consider those multimodalities also in some of those hyper trained models that have that kind of multimodal features as well.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's a great point. We're getting close to our endpoint at 45 minutes. So to bring us back to where we started, saying that the audience of educators joining us today have a wide range of experience across AI, from early adopters to just dabbling in it. But one thing that we all have in common is that we all need to continue learning and continue growing in terms of our practice with AI. So to close it out, what is one piece of advice that you all have to help teachers build their AI literacy over the next few months? What is something that they should be focusing on?
Well, I personally would just recommend that they actually are trying it on different things, because everybody's workflow is different and everybody's work stream is different. And so just trying things that you do that require a lot of time, and maybe that you're doing over and over, just start trying some of the different tasks that you do in one of these models, and just see, it's not going to be the magic bullet for everything, but depending on your workflow, there will be things that it can do to help you. And so you've got to kind of discover what those are. And the way to do that is just by trying it out, exploring. But there's 3 years ago, there wasn't much information out there, but there's a lot of information available now. And so if you really want to learn yourself, whether you're being provided training or not, there's a lot of ways to learn. Our North Carolina guidelines it could be like a quick 101 for AI itself, and so things like that. Learn how to prompt is important. It's not necessarily prompt engineering, but you've got to make sure that you're giving it a lot of context. And so if you're not successful, that's usually where you're going wrong, is the prompting needs some work. So I would specifically explore some of the materials out there to teach you how to prompt effectively.
And I know I've been kind of hypercritical of how the tools work. I still use them regularly in the context of kind of building educational materials and supporting teachers and learners. So, you know, finding ways to mitigate those problems, I think, is paramount. I think pushing back on the tools is useful. Really kind of questioning the responses so that you get ask it to explain itself, ask to provide its rationale. I think building your identity prompt is useful so that you're getting those kinds of those better responses. Give it permission to say it doesn't know something, otherwise it's going to make something up. And then sometimes I'll use two different models and kind of play their responses off of each other and see, where I might get something that more closely aligns with what I'm looking for, my purpose and my values. But, the goal isn't to become an expert, right? This is about collaboration. This is about how we kind of augment ourselves and enhance ourselves, not just attach AI to something because that's the trendy thing to do right now.
Mhm.
I would also add that this is a great tool for teachers to collaborate and work together, but it's also a great equalizer for kids, especially kids in special education. So as educators, we need to start thinking about how we're embedding AI into our actual coursework, how we can empower these kids and how we can democratize the opportunity so that when they enter the workforce, they have the strategic partner of AI so they can really rock the workplace. And so I would think about in your departments, as a school, as a district, how AI is being taught to the kids, not just us as teachers. So I think that's an important element that I don't want to lose sight of today.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that would be a great follow-up webinar. That could be a whole other topic, AI for students. All right, we are at time now. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for our panelists. I think this was really valuable and helpful. At least I learned a lot today. Hopefully you guys did too. There will be a survey when we end this that pops up. I would love for you guys to fill that out. We're always looking for feedback and looking for ways to improve for our next webinars. All right, thank you. Have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vera and John.